Power, authority, and control. At the beginning of this trial, that's what I told you I thought you would find at the very base of this case. And that didn't become any clearer than yesterday when the defendant testified. I want to talk first, before we get into the other evidence and before we get into the elements of the offense, about the defendant's testimony and about what it shows us. The defendant used words and phrases that basically put the blame entirely on Natalia. Natalia has all of these problems. He used phrases like, I gave her multiple chances to come clean, that there was a lack of trust, that she hurt him. He described that he had a great relationship with his daughter, that it's wonderful. He said that they were trying to co-parent, to have their daughter grow up with two parents. He said that every time he extended that trust to Natalia, she fell short. She told him at one point that she didn't love him and hadn't loved him since the first month that they were married, and that really hurt him. He said that during the time when they weren't speaking, that she was very cold. He said that she was dating other people that he would not consider dignifying around his daughter. And then, in talking about that argument that they had in the truck on March 22nd, 2016, that she didn't tell him about a work meeting that was really a private meeting or something to that effect, that was the drip that filled the cup that made it overflow, which I would describe as a breaking point. He said that at that moment he got out of the car, he saw the neighbor's house, and he became more agitated. He said that he felt that he didn't have her as a partner to rely on anymore, and that he couldn't take it anymore. He then described that he always has a weapon on him, because he has a concealed pistol license. Then they begin driving from their family home, their former family home on Goulson. He tells you at one point he loses his temper, and he punches his wife in the face a couple times. He doesn't remember how many. He doesn't remember where he was punching. He wasn't really looking. And then at one point he pulls the weapon out. And when we're talking about this, and when you were listening, and when you go back and you deliberate this case, ask yourself if this makes sense. He said he gets the gun out and he's waving it around, and then he points it at his own temple. And then according to him, Natalia grabs the gun and pulls it down. And he feels the car swerving, he looks at the road, and then he hears the gun go off. But his finger was on the trigger. Somehow that bullet travels straight through Natalia's left calf into the right leg. Somehow. And at that point, he said he didn't really know if she was shot or not. He thought maybe she was, maybe it was a scrape. But then he describes that he needed a moment to collect his thoughts, to decide what to do next, somewhere somewhat private. And so he just happens to go to this field in the middle of Detroit. He just happens upon this desolate field in the middle of Detroit. He says that it's only then he realized that she's shot, and at first on direct he described that Natalia was screaming, and she said it hurt. So he tells you that he cuts her pant leg open to look at her wounds, but that it wasn't an emergency. He says because it wasn't bleeding. You saw the pictures of that truck. You saw the pictures, and you saw in person Natalia's clothes and the blanket that covered her at some point. You know, based on those pictures, based on that evidence, how much blood there was in that car. But he said it's not an emergency. And he asked me, well, I don't know what an emergency is to you. An emergency, I would think, is something when somebody is shot in both legs. That's an emergency. But he said it wasn't life-threatening. So he didn't feel it was an emergency. So what does he do? He keeps his wife in a field for over 17 hours. He says at one point that when he went to go inspect the wounds, he felt like she was unpredictable. So he took the handcuffs out and handcuffed her to the seatbelt. That's admitting to the unlawful imprisonment. He handcuffs her to the seatbelt because she's unpredictable. And when asked about her being unpredictable, why was she unpredictable? Because she pulled a gun that he allegedly pointed to his head away from his own head to try to stop him from shooting himself in a car? That's an example of her being unpredictable? He tells you that this whole plan, that it was they were going to commit suicide. Notice the word "we were going to commit suicide." Natalia tells you, and we'll get into her testimony in much more detail in a bit, that she was not suicidal when she got into that truck that day, that she thought that she was going to go see her daughter. She told you that she didn't want to die. That wasn't the defendant's plan. That wasn't what we heard from him. That was not his plan. He told us yesterday what his intent was, and his intent was at the very least that she was not leaving that field. She was not leaving that field alive. He said that he couldn't see a good way out at that point. And then he says that Natalia is on the phone multiple times. But remember back to Detective Markle's testimony. She looked at the phone. The only calls that were being made from Natalia's phone that night was through that Signal app that she talked about. And who were those calls to? Those calls were to Alex. And then we had Alex come in and tell us. And Alex said that she got calls from both the defendant and Natalia, and that it was the defendant who asked her to come out to the field. She said that in her conversations with Natalia, she could barely, but could, hear the defendant in the background. This supports what Natalia told us. Alex tells you that she comes to the field, she stops some yards away from their truck, she gets out, the defendant comes, they meet, she asks what's happening. And the defendant says something to the effect of, "I can't do it anymore." And then she asks, or makes some indication to go towards the truck. And what does the defendant do? Tell her, "Don't go near the truck. Don't go to the truck." And why is it? Because at that point, what we know from the evidence, what the evidence has shown in this case, is because Natalia was in that truck, beaten, broken, and bloody, being held in that field. He tells us that he passes out and then has these two encounters, one with that unknown individual and then one when Officer Kolar finds them. He tells us that he shows Officer Kolar his badge because he thinks that it'll help get him some help faster. Because at this point he's now decided that suicide was a stupid plan. This doesn't make sense. His testimony doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense with the evidence. Officer Kolar said that the defendant represented that he was a law enforcement officer at that point. And Officer Kolar says, "Oh, you're law enforcement?" And the defendant nods his head. He denied that yesterday. When you go back and you evaluate the testimony of each witness, you can evaluate the defendant's testimony the same as you would any other witness. At that point, I submit that he was trying to hide what he had done. Yes, the car was out of gas, but I don't think he accounted for the car running out of gas. I don't think he accounted for how he was going to get out of that field after he left Natalia there to die, following the assault and the injuries that he inflicted on her. Officer Kolar tells us that the defendant shows the badge and then shows his gun. A gun that it seemed like the defendant was trying to distance himself from yesterday. The same gun, I believe, that Natalia, allegedly according to him, shot herself with, which completely conflicts with Natalia's testimony, and I think completely conflicts as you'll look at in the photos and as you've seen with those wounds, with those gunshot wounds. The defendant's testimony was not credible. It doesn't make sense. He didn't account for the stab wounds that Natalia suffered. He didn't account for the blood trail. He didn't explain her testimony that at some point he was sitting on her chest, beating her over the head with that gun, strangling her. She has lacerations on the top of her head. How did she get those if he was only punching her a couple times in the car? She had bruises all over her body. And you'll have a chance to go through the medical records. And there's a body diagram in there that we're going to look at in a second. And that broken jaw. Could that broken jaw, a mandible fracture that Dr. Taylor explained to us, where the bones were offset from one another? They thought she was going to have surgery, but luckily she didn't have to. It just had to be treated conservatively. Was that really from just a couple punches in the face in the car? It doesn't make sense. I, as the prosecutor, have the burden of proof in this case. And what you've seen, what the evidence shows, the ample evidence that we have, is that the defendant is guilty of each and every single one of these counts. And because I have the burden, I get to talk with you twice. And so the first time, I like to go through each charge and each element of that charge and talk about the evidence that we've seen and talk about how the evidence that we've seen proves that charge beyond a reasonable doubt. And then the defense attorney is going to talk to you, and then I get to talk to you again. So let's start with the first count. One minute.
That's confidential. That'll break the confidentiality agreement or the EEO stuff.
Whoa, that is the most CEO thing you've ever said. Oh my gosh, you might make it after all.
The person who really has to
Well, you know why.
But the real reason that you're doing this because you don't want everybody knowing, because now everybody gonna want to raise it.
Yeah.
And see, that's when you gotta cut all that down. And that's how we created this.
That's your
sorry ass law I just put.
Well, can we know? Well, we already know that you make
Okay, well, we might abandon the PowerPoint.
more than we do.
Well, can we get that number? What is it you make? That number, 276 times more than
Okay. Count one, assault with intent to murder. Now, let's look back at opening. We talked a lot about each of these charges, and so the first element, you know, is that the defendant tried to physically injure another person. In this case, what is the evidence shown? Not only did he just try, he injured her severely. You're going to see in the medical records that have been admitted a body diagram when the doctors evaluated her that shows the injuries to her body. All of those bruises, those lacerations, gunshot wounds. You have the testimony of Dr. Taylor who tells you about these. You have the stab wounds to her legs. You have the bullet entry on her left leg that goes through, looks not so nice when it comes out on the other side of the left leg and enters into her right leg. And it stays there until she has it removed later, and you'll get to see that bullet if you'd like. You saw it yesterday when Detective Drabkowski showed us. She has the injuries to her face, her broken jaw, the lacerations to her head, to her scalp. She has the injuries to her hands, and let's not forget the stab wound to her hand, which Natalia tells us she received when she was attempting to stop the defendant from stabbing her. The second element is that when he committed the assault, he had the ability to cause injury, or at least believed he had the ability to. I think this one is obvious. He tells you that he always carries a weapon. He had the gun, he had the knife, he had the means with his fist, and he did inflict those injuries on her, and that's what the evidence has shown. The third element, and this is the one that I ask that you pay special attention to, and this is the one I think that you have to focus on, this is the intent element. That at the time that the defendant committed the assault, he specifically intended to kill her, such that if she had died, the killing would be murder. Now, we talked in voir dire also about that baseball player. And the defense attorney in his opening said something that I think is interesting. He said, we can never get in somebody else's head. But we don't have to get inside somebody else's head to know what their intent is. And that's not what the law says that we have to do. The law says that we can prove somebody's intent by looking at what they did, what they said, how they did it, and you can look at any other circumstances that you'd like. That baseball player, when he goes up to swing, he's not yelling, I'm going to hit the ball. But he takes his stance, he takes the bat, he raises it back, and when the pitch comes, he swings. He might miss, but his intent was to hit that ball. And we know that based on what he did, how he looked, and all of those other circumstances. He's at a ballpark, he's in his uniform, there's a bat in his hand. So we know what his intent was. Just like in this case, we know what the defendant's intent was if we look at all of the evidence in this case. The evidence in this case has shown that he specifically intended to kill Natalia Muntean. The intent has to be, it can't be an impulse, or if someone had acted rationally such that it would be manslaughter if she had died. And we know that's not the case in this case. How do we know that? Because we have Natalia's testimony. Natalia tells us that the defendant takes out his gun, that he has it, he's waving it, he points it at her once. This is when He is driving southbound on 75 in Detroit, in Wayne County. He has the gun, he's waving it, he points it at her legs once, she pushes it away to try to protect herself. And then he points it again and he aims it, she tells us. He aims at her legs and he fires, incapacitating her. And this incapacitation is going to be relevant to other counts that we'll talk about, particularly unlawful imprisonment and torture. After she's incapacitated, she tells us that he drives her to this field, this desolate field. We know that she's in that field for sometime around 17 hours. After he shoots her in the leg, we know that he doesn't get her any help. He doesn't call 911. He doesn't take her to a doctor. He does nothing to help her. He lets her bleed, and you can see that in those photos. You can see, again, the blood all over the truck. After this, what does he do? He takes her out to the field. Oh, and I'm sorry, he's already punched her at this point in time. He takes her out to the field where he handcuffs her. At one point, she's out of the vehicle. He sits on her chest. He beats her over the head. We know that her clothes get taken off. We don't know how exactly, but we know that the only thing that she took off voluntarily was her jacket. She tells you she remembers at one point her clothing, her shirt is split open, and her chest is exposed. And what does the defendant do? He takes the knife and he runs it down her chest. He beats her, he strangles her, he lets her bleed, he lets her body temperature fall to 81 degrees. That's a testimony that we have from Sarah Shoeboy, the EMT who first arrived, saying that she'd never seen anyone that was beaten that badly. And on questioning by defense counsel, she said, yes, she was probably hypothermic. And Natalia was naked from the waist down, the blanket covering her. In determining the defendant's intent, we know what Natalia looked like when help arrived. What did the defendant look like? He had on his jeans, his sweater, his jacket, and his hat. He was fine. At no point did he get her help. In fact, he had somebody come to the field. He had Alex come to the field. Did Alex bring any type of aid? Did he ask Alex for any help for his wife, who had been, at least at this point, shot and beaten? No. No one came. He didn't ask anyone to come. He did nothing because he wanted her to die in that field. That was his intent. He specifically intended to kill her when he committed this assault, and that's what the evidence shows. The defendant also didn't account for that blood trail out in the field. We know that Natalia was out there, we can assume, because there were clumps of her hair found out in the field.
Coming to Shane Park, July 22nd, it is Tower of Power with Sheila E.
I don't have to prove, the judge is going to tell you, motive. I just have to prove in each of these charges that the defendant committed the crime and that he meant to do so. We can speculate on what his motive was, and I think he gave you a good idea yesterday when he testified. He was upset with Natalia. He couldn't trust her. She wasn't a partner for him anymore, and he wanted their daughter to himself. This, I believe, is why he did all of the things that he did, to gain that power and control. But all of the physical evidence that you've seen in Natalia's testimony, what she remembers about what happened to her, that's all evidence of what happened, and that is all evidence of the defendant's intent. And his intent can be proven by circumstantial evidence. What he said, what he did, how he did it, and any other facts and circumstances. Some things that we want to look at as well, planning. He took her to this field at a time when she was supposed to be in Chicago. She was supposed to be getting help. And Nadia was safely taken care of in the hands of her daycare provider. So we want to look at defendant's planning. Look at their relationship the weapons that were involved, the wounds that were inflicted, his actions, and the fact that he took her to a secluded location. We know, as far as weapons, the gun was involved, the knife, and his fist. With the wounds, we went over. His actions, Natalia tells you that she didn't want to die, that she was scared. Why didn't she call for help? Because she didn't want to get hurt anymore. And they were in this secluded field for about 17 hours. Going back to motive, let's talk about March 21st. Natalia tells you that she takes some Molly at the defendant's house. She wants to go to the hospital when she starts to have some symptoms. He tells her he's not going to drive her, so she goes to drive herself. She ends up calling 911 on the way. She's taken to the hospital and then the police. She eventually calls the defendant to come pick her up because she needs a ride home from the police station. And he was not happy about having to come get her. The next day, so he picks her up at about 2 a.m., the same day that the incident that we're here for starts. He picks her up later that day, sometime around 6 p.m., she tells us. And then she's found around noon, March 23rd. About 17 hours in that truck, in that field, bleeding, broken. You can see from the photos, from the map, and from the bird's eye view that we've seen a couple times, how desolate and deserted this field is. You have the testimony from the evidence technician, Angela Anderson-Cobb, that there's really nothing in this field except for trash, and it's near that abandoned warehouse. No one around. And he knew this.
Did you hear him though? Did you just hear him?
He backs the truck in, and that's where Natalia remains. All of the evidence is scattered throughout the field. Like we already talked about, her clothing that's cut into pieces, that's scattered far back behind the truck. The blood trail, the wipes, and let's talk about the wipes and that antiseptic spray. So both Natalia and the defendant tell us that at some point he gives her antiseptic spray for these wounds. He gives her antiseptic spray for the gunshot wounds that he inflicted. And then and he told us that he wanted to keep them as clean as possible until he could decide what to do next. That doesn't make any sense. If the pact was that they would both go commit suicide, why is he keeping her wounds clean? If both of them intended that they were going to go to that field and they were going to commit suicide, why is he keeping her wounds clean? Why is he saying that? That doesn't make any sense. After giving her the antiseptic spray, what does he do? He continues to inflict more wounds on her. He stabs her around the gunshot wound. We know that she showed you saw from the picture earlier, and she showed you her scars. She showed you the scars on her upper thigh and around the wounds, and you saw the wounds yourself. Again, the blood in the truck, around the truck. And again, the defendant. When he's arrested, you saw in the photos, pants, jacket, sweater, hat. Barely a scratch on him. If this was a suicide pact, why is Natalia the only one who is beaten, shot, stabbed, and strangled? Blood on his jeans. And then there's the duct tape. Natalia tells us that she can't remember parts of what happened in the field. She remembers certain things that she told us about. She doesn't know how the duct tape, all of it, ended up in the field. We know that there's blood on that duct tape. And we know from Sarah Shoeboy that she had duct tape on her upper thigh. The defense attorney, through questioning, was asking if it was like a tourniquet. But Sarah Shoeboy's testimony, as I recall, was that it wasn't wrapped tightly around. It was kind of stuck there. We have the phones. How do we know that the defendant intended to kill Natalia? Because not one time did he call and ask for help when he had the opportunity to. Instead, he tried to say, like we talked about before, that Natalia was on the phone, but that she never called for help. We know why she didn't call for help. We know that her blood was found on the duct tape. We had the DNA analyst come and tell us that this duct tape, placard 5, black duct tape, that it contained both of their DNA. And the rest, everything else that was tested, was Natalia's DNA. Natalia's hair, found in the field, behind that truck. The extensive blood trail that led somewhere around 40 feet, I believe, somewhere in that area. And I should say, if at any point, if your memory is different than mine, go with yours. You're the judge of the facts and of the evidence in this case. And so if I say something and you don't think that's right, go with your memory. And remember that what we say, what the lawyers say, is not evidence. The evidence comes from the witness chair and from the physical exhibits that you've seen. Clothing strewn all over the field. Her undergarments in that field. Her top cut, that bra is cut, you could see that. He wanted, why did he do this? Like I said, he wanted to gain control of his daughter. He forced her to fill out that custody paperwork. Yes, the paperwork says that she's not under duress at the time. But at this point in time, Natalia wants to do anything that she can to please him. It's a typical domestic violence situation. She is doing what she can to please him because of his reaction if she doesn't. And so she does all of these things to appease him. She files the report of the PPO because he wants to be the sole provider for Nadia. And he made her believe that she was a bad parent. She knew she wasn't. But because he told her over and over again, he made her believe that she was. Let's look at their demeanor. Also talking about the defendant's intent. How do we know? Let's look at his demeanor the day of the assault. According to Natalia, he was immediately accusatory, aggressive, demanding, controlling, and deceitful to Officer Kolar. Officer Kolar tells us that he says he's law enforcement, and then he says that he nods his head, acknowledging that he's law enforcement. And then he tells us that he's there to pick up his girlfriend who had gotten beaten up. Doesn't say anything about his wife who's bleeding, broken, and dying with a body temperature of 81 degrees in his truck. He's trying to keep Officer Kolar away at that point. He is trying to do everything he can to try to keep from being discovered because his plan was that Natalia would die in that field. Let's look at Natalia's demeanor on that day. She was scared. She tells you that she's not suicidal. She was begging. She just wanted it to stop. All the pain, all the hurt. According to Sarah Shoeboy, the EMT, she was soft-spoken, quiet. Power, authority, and control. The defendant's intent is clear. He wanted to isolate Natalia from her parents, from their daughter. He wanted her to go get treatment so that she would be away. And he planned this time because everybody would think that she was away in Chicago. Remember that he was going to come back. He was going to leave her in Chicago, and he was going to come back to take care of Nadia. He wanted to take away Natalia's freedom. Natalia just didn't want to make him mad, and she just didn't want to get hurt anymore. So, assault with intent to murder. The defendant tried to physically injure another person, Natalia Muntean. We know that he did based on the evidence. He had the ability to. We know that he did, based on those wounds, based on those injuries. Dr. Taylor's testimony, Natalia's testimony, testimony of Sarah Shoeboy, and that he intended to kill Natalia Muntean. We know what his intent was because we can see it in her injuries, in the fact that he did nothing to help her, and when he described that we were going to commit suicide. Doesn't make any sense. He wanted to isolate Natalia. He wanted her out of the picture. He was upset with her. So he took her to this field at a time when everybody would think that she was in Chicago, and he tried to kill her. But she lived. Count 2, assault with intent to commit great bodily harm less than murder. Much of these elements are the same, except that the last one. So I'm not going to talk about the first two because all the same evidence that we've discussed goes to those first two elements. But as for the last one, it's that the defendant intended to commit great bodily harm as opposed to specifically kill. What is great bodily harm? Great bodily harm is any physical injury that could seriously harm the health or function of the body. And again, with this count, interestingly different from what we're going to talk about later, is I don't have to prove that there was an actual injury. Except in this case, as we know, there was. There were many actual injuries. And you can consider those injuries in determining the defendant's intent. The great bodily harm can be even established by itself just based on that gunshot wound. Shooting someone in the legs is intending to cause them great bodily harm. Natalia tells you that she remembers the sound, like her ears popping. She remembers the smoke. She says that she was in shock. I think she said she remembered screaming. She tells you that she tries to get out of the truck then at one point and she can't walk because he had shot her through both legs. The evidence in this case proves beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant at the very least committed assault with intent to do great bodily harm, but it proves more than that. When you look at all of the evidence together of this continued assault, it proves that he intended to kill her. Count 3, unlawful imprisonment. Yesterday, the defendant essentially admitted that this happened. He said that she was unpredictable, and so she took out the handcuffs, and he handcuffed her to the seatbelt. But I submit to you that it's more than that. Yes, we have the handcuffs. He handcuffed her, and we know those handcuffs were still on her when she got to the hospital. And we know from the testimony that it wasn't a police officer that placed those handcuffs on. You heard from Officer Steen, who said that he was asked by the hospital staff to take them off. But again, it's more than that. He incapacitated her. He made it so that she couldn't run away, even if she had wanted to or even if she had tried, before taking her to this field. So, what are the elements of unlawful imprisonment? First, that the defendant knowingly restrained another person by any of the following means. But what does restrain mean? It means to forcibly restrict a person's movement or to forcibly confine the person so as to interfere with their liberty without their consent and without lawful authority. How do we know that it was without consent? Natalia told us she didn't want to be handcuffed, she didn't want to be kept in that field, and she didn't want to be shot. He restrained her, we know, by force. He forcibly restrained her with those handcuffs to the seatbelt, and he restrained her by force by shooting her in the legs, making it so that she couldn't leave. And so also the person was restrained by means of a weapon. This is what we have in this case. He shot her in the legs. They were secretly confined. So, yes, he took her to this field, and yes, Alex came out there. But no one else knew about this. He wasn't intending for anybody else to know about it. And why did Alex come out there? To take some money. About $2,000, she said, in cash, to settle some things up. Interestingly, though, the defendant mentioned that he still, I guess, had money on him because he tried to ask that person in the pickup truck for gas, and he was going to give them money. Again, his testimony doesn't make sense. So second, the person was restrained to facilitate the commission of another felony or to facilitate flight after the commission of another felony. In this case, the evidence has shown that Natalia was restrained so that the defendant could continue his assault, continue with his attempt to kill her. Because after he restrains her, by shooting her, after he restrains her, by handcuffing her, he beats her, he strangles her, and he leaves her there to bleed out in the truck. Yes, at one point the handcuffs were removed from the seatbelt, because we know that because they were able to get her out of the car without having to take the handcuffs off the seatbelt. But the restraint doesn't have to happen for any particular length of time. And it can be incidental to or in conjunction with any other crimes. And that's what we have in this case. So the restraint doesn't have to last for any particular point. And in this case, it was in conjunction with the commission of other crimes. Count 4, felonious assault. The first element is that the defendant either attempted to commit a battery on Natalia Muntean or did an act that would cause a reasonable person to fear or apprehend an immediate battery. What is a battery? We talked about this. It's a forceful or violent touching. What is the evidence shown in this case? The felonious assault charge is made out from the facts that Natalia gives us in the truck with the gun. When the defendant has the gun and he's waving it around, and what is Natalia thinking? She tells us she's thinking, this is so dangerous. What if it goes off? What if he shoots me? That's a fear of an immediate battery. And he attempted to commit that battery on her when he first points the gun at her legs, and she pushes it away. Next, that he's intended to injure the person or intended to put them in fear of an immediate battery, very similar to what we just talked about. If you are pointing a gun at someone, you are intending to make them fear an immediate battery. And that's exactly what the defendant did in this case. And that's exactly what the evidence through Natalia's testimony has shown. Again, there's that element that he had the ability to commit the battery. This one is simple. And that he committed the assault with a pistol. You've seen the gun that was recovered from him. Natalia tells you about the gunshot. We won't go over that again. But the evidence has shown that he committed the assault with a pistol. And after he points it at her that one time, and she pushes it away, he brings it right back and he points it at her again and he fires. Count 5, felony firearm. This count simply means that when he committed a crime, in this case, either the assault with intent to murder, the assault with intent to do great bodily harm less than murder, or the felonious assault that we just talked about, that he had a firearm at the time. So for all the same reasons, he said he always had a weapon on him. He admitted to having the weapon on him. We know he did. And it was during the commission of one of those felonies that we just talked about. Count 6, aggravated domestic violence. The first element is that the defendant assaulted Natalia Muntean. The defendant essentially admitted to this count in its totality when he talked about how he punched her in the truck. He assaulted her. At the time, Natalia was his spouse and or they had a child together. We know this from both parties. Natalia tells us they are still married, and the defendant tells us they're still married, and we know that they have a child together. And the assault caused a serious or aggravated injury. So a serious or aggravated injury is one that requires medical treatment. It's a little bit different than the great bodily harm. We know that she had those injuries on her face. He even says that she had some redness. He described it as some redness that kind of bruised up, I think was his words. Some redness. Count 7, torture. What is torture? There are elements, and we'll go through those. But torture is basically when you inflict upon someone a bunch of small, painful wounds, like little paper cuts, before the ultimate blow. In this case, from the point that he shoots Natalia in the legs, according to Natalia's testimony, until she's found, the defendant is responsible for all of the pain that she suffered during that time, for those 17 hours. Picks her up around 6, 17 hours in that truck. In between that period of time, what happens to her? He stabs her. He beats her over the head with a gun. He breaks her jaw. He causes her immense pain. And he doesn't get her any help. She's restrained. At some point we know she's duct taped. No help comes for her. No help from him. Because he's intending she doesn't make it out of that field alive. We know what Natalia looks like after the brutal assault. Her hands are bloody. Her face is bloody. Her face is so swollen. You had a chance, you know what she looks like right after the assault, and you had a chance to observe her. She's almost unrecognizable between what she looked like after the defendant was done with her and what she looks like when she came to court to testify. She's in the hospital for days. You see her gunshot wounds, her stab wounds, the bullet that remains in her leg until she has it taken out. So what is torture? The first element is that the defendant intended to cause cruel or extreme physical, mental pain or suffering. We know that. What is physical pain? What is great bodily injury, loss of substantial impairment of a body function? It means serious visible disfigurement, skull or serious bone fracture, subdural bleeding or bruising. Again, you have the medical records and evidence. You can read those. You also have Dr. Taylor's testimony who tells you about all of the injuries that Natalia suffered. She suffered a serious bone fracture. Jaw is broken. She suffered all of those bruisings, all of the bleeding under the skin. Her eye swollen, the lacerations to her scalp. She had multiple lacerations all over her body. The stab wound, her head that she had to have stapled. At the time, he had physical custody or control over her. And that he used threat of force to either confine her by interfering with her liberty. It's the same kind of thing as that unlawful imprisonment count. We know that he did that because we know he handcuffed her and we know he drove her to this desolate field. He absolutely, the evidence shows, had physical control over her, and he exercised that through force, or threat of force. She told you she was afraid of him. She was just scared. And the last one is that the defendant intended to cause Natalia Muntean to suffer cruel or extreme physical pain, mental pain, or suffering. I don't need to prove that she actually suffered any pain, but we know that she did. How do we know that he intended to cause her this extreme pain? We know, again, because of the nature of the injuries, because of how he had her in the field. We know that she was undressed, the blanket over her at some point. And the question of when he put that blanket over her. According to Officer Kolar's testimony, he went back to his truck to get his identification. He had ample time at that point to put the blanket over her. He knew at that point that he was discovered. So he had ample time at that point. The rest of the time, we can assume from the evidence that she didn't have a blanket over her, that she had nothing covering her, even though, as we saw from the photos of the defendant's truck, he had ample items of cover to give her in the back of his truck. Because for whatever reason, her clothes, he had taken off and strewn them throughout the field, cut them open, exposing her, embarrassing her, humiliating her. The evidence has shown that the defendant tortured Natalia. We know he had physical custody or control over her, that he exercised that custody or control without her consent because she told you she didn't want to be there, that at the time he intentionally caused her great bodily injury, and that he intended her to suffer cruel or extreme physical pain. The evidence has shown beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed a crime of torture. We look at all the circumstances in this case, the handcuffs, her injuries, all of the evidence in that field, all the evidence that you had an opportunity to see. I think there's something like 164 pieces of evidence, a lot of those are photos, that if you'd like at any point in time to look at, you can. The state of the defendant when he gets arrested, he's fine. We saw those pictures of him. He has some redness on his wrist, which could easily be from the handcuffs that he was in. Other than that, he has a couple maybe scrape on his knee and maybe some redness under his eye. Natalia, severely injured. She didn't want to get hurt anymore. And lastly, we have the defendant's statement when they get to the field. No one will find us here for a month. We know that his plan was for Natalia to not leave that field, regardless of what her wishes were. We know because he makes statements like this. Did he ever explicitly say, "I'm going to kill you"? No. Does that mean that that wasn't his plan? Absolutely not. That baseball batter doesn't scream, "I'm going to hit the ball," when he swings that bat. And in this case, the defendant may not have said, "I'm going to kill you," but he sure, the evidence shows, did a lot to try. Beat her, stabbed her, strangled her, shot her, broke her jaw, and left her to get hypothermic in the field without getting her help. All of this evidence points to defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt of each of those charges. And I told you at the beginning that there are times where you might ask why Natalia stayed. Why didn't she leave? She was, getting therapy. Remember, Natalia's not on trial. She didn't do anything wrong by staying with the defendant. But the evidence has shown what the defendant did, what he intended to do. In this very typical abuser domestic violence situation. She's a typical domestic violence victim. And you could see from his testimony that he's a typical domestic violence abuser. All of this evidence, including, I forgot to mention the testimony of Judy Redmond yesterday that you heard. At that counseling appointment where the defendant admits to assaulting Natalia, admits to punching her, and says it was because she lied. And when Ms. Redmond asks if he's going to do it again, what is his answer? His answer is not, "No, I feel horrible, I would never do that again, I'm so sorry." His answer is yes, if she lies again. And he told us yesterday that she lied again on the 22nd. And this is what the evidence shown the defendant did. Took Natalia out to the field with the plan for her not to leave alive. Because the evidence in this case overwhelmingly proves beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant committed each and every one of the counts charged, I ask that you find him guilty. Thank you.
I'm going to take a recess. May be seated.
Mr. Bolden.